And we're live. It is Wednesday, November 18th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. It is now dusk at 5:01 p.m. in Washington, D.C. That means we are heading into the grim times when it is dark. And
It's dark here.
It's dark in Cape Cod. I assume it's not quite dark yet in Austin, Texas, Steve?
79 and sunny.
Oh, I hate you.
We hate Steve Vladeck. We will return to that.
Episode title.
But I ascertain that I have a few things to say before we have Steve Vladeck ascertain things. The first is that we are now more than 2 weeks into the coup attempt. And I want to say coups should be faster than this. If you're going to run a coup, coup means hit, right? I think my French is not great, but
Cut. It's cutting off the head.
Coup is a cut. Because in Spanish it's golpe de estado, right? It's a hit of state. I think these are, whether it's a cut or a blow, these are things that happen fast. They don't take 2 weeks. So if you're going to do a coup, I want you to do it right. I want you to, do it quickly. A coup is not an extended thing that goes on over a long period of time. So I just want to say, boneheaded coup, people. By the way, one thing you should do if you're going to do a coup, don't let them certify the election results. Because once you certify the election results, you get these appointed electors and they get to vote. You got to get to it before the electoral.
But then isn't that the only time it truly becomes a coup d'etat? Because otherwise it's just, you don't know what you're overthrowing. You have to have something to overthrow.
I don't know. I mean, if you're gonna do it, you gotta have the force of will to actually do the coup. And these are Nietzschean moments. And Nietzsche didn't sit around and philosophize. Of course he did, because he was a philosopher. But in the sort of Platonic Nietzsche, you're not sitting around and sort of thinking about a coup in slow motion. You're doing it, will to power and all that jazz. So if you're gonna convince the Secretary of State of Georgia to throw out the votes to get your answer, you can't just have a phone call about it. That's not that's just namby-pamby coup shit. If you're gonna do the coup, do the coup. If you're not gonna do the coup, concede the election. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we do get to make Steve Vladeck uncomfortable by talking about things like this in language like that. And that is a pretty good surrogate for fun. Steve Vladeck, welcome back to the show in the Four Seasons Landscape Gardening Total Landscape t-shirt. Is it really from the people?
No, it's from this online seller who's donating all the proceeds to the Democratic candidates in the Georgia runoff. So
excellent.
It's a good cause and a good shirt. I just want to point out, because you can't really see it, the line at the bottom is not the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia. Just in case there was some. So I also want to say, just in case there's any doubt on this, I actually am a member in good standing of the District of Columbia Bar.
I don't think I've gotten enough credit for breaking that news yesterday.
Hey,
so I'm glad.
I saw your tweet, Ben, a lot of places about Rudy's suspension for non-payment of dues, which just seems. I mean, the writers are just they're mailing it in at this point.
You cannot make this shit up. No. I mean,
we didn't even talk about the Rockefeller Christmas tree yet. That's it's. I couldn't make. You can't make that story up either. It's just insane.
But Rudy, let's talk about Rudy for a minute, because Rudy gives the total landscape, I always wants to, whenever I say total something, it wants to come out total quality landscaping. Um, Four Seasons total TQM landscaping.
What is like total landscaping? What's less than total landscaping? Like
partial landscaping.
Partial landscaping.
Mostly landscaping.
Mostly landscaping.
But I mean, the best part is Rudy. I mean, this is already not the current T-shirt for Rudy, right? We've already moved on to normal scrutiny as the new Rudy T-shirt. So he's good. Listen, he's good for T-shirt business. I mean, I guess that's something.
Oh,
hey,
God.
I mean, so Devin Nunes's lawyer in the chat really wants us to talk about Rudy. And we've gotten a lot of requests for a download on the events of yesterday. So, were you among the 4,000 gawkers who actually got to listen to the hearing, Steve?
No, but mostly because I was crashing up against a deadline, and so I was mostly following indirectly through social media and trying to pretend that I actually had better things to do.
Kate,
I assume you didn't listen to Rudy.
No. I'm actually also very, like, I was thinking about this last night. As you know, I don't follow the news super closely. And part of that is like deeply self-protection. Like that was like
we
a
love
thing
that about you, Kate.
But I took that, well, do you?
I do, yeah. I think it's awesome.
I was just like, all of this is going to happen whether I pay attention to it or not. I can't do anything about 99% of this. And it's just like giving me angina and not allowing me to sleep at night. And so like I just took a hard line of like not engaging in a lot of the news for a while. But I'm kind of very much looking forward to going back and becoming a well-informed member of the United States of America again. And I don't know, like this is part of it. Now this is all like, to me, this feels more like comedy and less nihilistic, like, but maybe not.
I have angst because I can't. I have been one of the many who has been enjoying dunking on Rudy on social media, and he sure makes it easy. I do fear though that we are in the process of dunking on Rudy. We are not legitimizing the narrative, right? But we are perpetuating the narrative that the blue checkmark crew, right, is out here sort of mocking the lawyer while he's fighting in court, when the story is not that Rudy is a terrible frickin' lawyer, right? The story is that Rudy, like all of the Trump lawyers, is admitting that there's no substance to their claims.
That's exactly right.
And so like, yeah, I'll sort of chuckle at dunking on Rudy, but let's put it like, the most important thing that happened yesterday was not when he said normal scrutiny, and it's not when he had no idea what Twombly and Iqbal are, right? The most important thing he said was when he was pressed on, do you have specific evidence to substantiate allegations of fraud? And he said no. Like that's, and that's, any lawyer could have said that. Every lawyer has said that. And I think that's the part that like all the Rudy dunking misses.
But this is like a really missed part of litigation. Steve, sorry, Ben, just really quickly. This is like a really key part of litigation. This is a key part of the law generally that I don't think people understand. It's like people, and I'm sure you get this all the time, is this illegal? Can I sue? And the answer is always yes. Are you going to win? Will a lawyer worth their salt take your fucking claim? Like, no. And like, you're not going to win. You're not going to pass like the pleading stage. Like there's never, but like, I just gave this advice to a friend who's having some type of domestic dispute and like, oh my gosh, like I'm afraid she's going to sue me or whatever. And I was like, she has nothing to sue you for. Like there's not, like she can try and it's going to cost you money to probably defend. It'll be annoying, but like, you're okay. Like this. And like, I don't, and that's kind of what I feel like the whole world is this example of, that has this example of with like the election stuff.
The personal litigation issue and the health of the democratic culture are, I think, an uneasy comparison, right? Like, I do things all the time that somebody could theoretically bring a suit for and they'd lose, but I'd have to defend it. That's happens when you're in the public domain. I would not fault the person's lawyer for bringing that case. I do think it's a different thing when you're talking about completely frivolous, meritless claims that are designed to and intended to erode people's confidence in a relatively clear electoral outcome. And so I do think the making fun of Rudy, in addition to the point that Steve makes, which is that the big story here, he's admitted that he's full of shit, right? That's big story number one. But big story number two is the part of mocking Rudy that I think is legit or is not a distraction from big story number one is, hey, are you on a campaign to discredit an electoral result that is actually real and the answer to that is yes. It is very fair to mock Rudy for that campaign and for, taking over leadership of that campaign when reputable law firms are starting to say, wait a minute, there's a line that we will not cross.
Yeah, but you're supposed to, I think you're right. This is not the same thing as what I'm describing. What Rudy's doing is like on steroids from like a historical and political perspective, its effect on democracy. I completely agree. But I'm just trying to say that like these standards exist in the law writ large, and like there are not a lot of lawyers who will bring bad claims. Like that's actually something that you're supposed to have that lawyers are supposed to exercise discretion around. I don't know. That's like, for me, I just think that this is completely, it's just more of the turning all of this into a moment to grift and a moment to turn up their brand of being anti-left to 11 or keep it at 11, even as things are like winding down for them. So that's kind of, yeah.
I think it dovetails with the whole question of like whether it was appropriate for the Lincoln Project to go after Jones Day, right? Because I think it's
such a good question,
right? It's because I am as a still current and former Guantanamo lawyer, right? Like I am sensitive to the sort of the shoe being on the other foot element of this, but on the flip side, I do think there is a big difference between representing deeply unpopular clients against whom the entire system is arrayed, like criminal defendants or enemy combatants detained as part of the war on terrorism, and bringing lawsuits that have one of two purposes, right? One is grift, right? And the less noble purpose is, undermining the legitimacy of a democratic process. And I guess, I would not have done what the Lincoln Project did were it up to me, but I understand the sentiment that there is something fundamentally unprofessional is not strong enough, like counter to the ethos of being a lawyer, of using the judicial system as a mechanism, not for achieving a result in court, but for perpetuating a narrative that is anti-democratic at its core. And to me, like the bigger story yesterday was not, Rudy's fumblings in Pennsylvania. The bigger story was the two Republican canvassers, right, on the Wayne County Board of Canvassers, who refused to exercise their entirely ministerial duty to certify the Wayne County results because of a complete lack of, evidence of fraud.
Totally.
First thought when I heard that story, which came in on Twitter while I was driving back from the cabin in the woods, and Tammy, who was sitting shotgun while I was driving, said, holy shit, look what happened in Wayne County, and read me these tweets. My first thought was writ of mandamus. I think that was clearly their first thought too, because they relatively quickly reversed themselves. Do
you remember, I learned about writ of mandamus in law school and thought I'd never need to know that ever again.
I just won a writ of mandamus case. So
I know you did.
and I won it in the fucking D.C. circuit. So I say pfa to everybody who says
you and Al Nashiri have something in common, Ben.
Exactly. Well, no, he actually got a writ of mandamus. Scott and I just scared the government into complying with its actual legal obligations because they had Jesus, we could actually lose this kind of moment. Look, I have a different view of the Jones Day issue, but I also agree with you that the Guantanamo lawyer aspect is a really interesting counterpoint. So, is it 12 years ago now? A group of people on the right started going after your friend and mine, Jen Daskal, who was then a young lawyer in the National Security Division at Justice, because of previous Guantanamo representations that Jen had been involved in when she was at Human Rights Watch. And I got together a group of, I wouldn't say, I've never been a Republican, so it wasn't a sort of Republican group, but it was a kind of people who were kind of on the more conservative side of national security issues. Oren Kerr recently reminded me of this because he was one of the people who signed this statement that I drafted and we stuck up on the Brookings website, which was, hey, it's really important to let people represent clients. And Oren's point, which I agree with, is I'm not going to go criticize Jones Day about representing a client. And I share your view that it's different when it's a client the entire system is arrayed against than when it's a client who actually is the power structure, as we used to say in the 60s when I wasn't born yet. But I also think I'm not going to be the person who says, don't take on a client, don't take on a representation. I do think it is perfectly fair for the Lincoln Project, which is not me, it's not invested in it's not a part of the legal system, to say, what the fuck are you guys doing? And it is perfectly fair when they do that for me to say, I'm not going to get on board with that because I'm kind of with Oren. I want to protect the space for Jen Daskal and Steve Vladeck to represent al-Nashiri and the people who at Guantanamo, and there are lines, but I don't think that the Lincoln Project necessarily needs to draw the line in exactly the same place I do. I'm not comfortable with it. I wouldn't get on board with that. But I also think, by the way, just as we say in the context of the Guantanamo case, we've had Michel Paradis, who's spent the last 20 years representing Guantanamo detainees. We've had him on and not imputed any attitude of his clients to him. We've just had him on as a guy who wrote a really cool book about the Doolittle Raiders. And by the way, he also represents al-Nashiri, to be precise, to use your example, represented by Michel Paradis. I do think that kind of a representation is a little bit of a different thing. And by the way, Michelle has gone through life, as have you, having Lincoln Project-like people say, you're fucking traitors to the country. And people like me saying, come on, that's fucking ridiculous. And I think that, I don't think that's the most unhealthy tension in the world. And so I'm not going to spend time criticizing the Lincoln Project for this. I'm also not going to sign up for going after Jones Day for it.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm sorry, Kate, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Steve.
I think here where I'm stuck, right, is the notion that the moment we're in right now is in any way comparable to any other moments we've experienced in our professional lives. Because there are days, or at least there are parts of days, where I feel like we are as close to a serious crisis in this country as we've been at any point that I've been alive. And like Detroit last night was an example of this to me, right? Because, the question is, at what point is this business as usual? And at what point is this actually a democratic emergency? Where, a large, indefensible chunk of the country believes that the only way that Joe Biden becomes president on January 20th is because he will have stolen the election from Trump in the absence of any actual judicially admissible data supporting that conclusion. And I just, I don't know. I guess what I'm struggling with, right, is how do those of us who are public facing and talking about this moment, right, how do we try to shape the conversation in a way that actually is in any way helpful besides just the catharsis of dunking on, a poor schlub like Rudy, right? By, trying to, for example, shame someone like John Cornyn, right, into getting off of the frickin' fence and saying Biden won, right? By trying to actually how do we create more Chris Krebses and fewer Emily Murphys?
Yeah, I see that, and I'm going to make a more kind of like principled stand against what the Lincoln Project did with regard to Jones Day, and that is like, I had no problem with anything they did. Like, listen, we have a way, ideally, to get rid of someone that we disagree with massively and we think is like threatening the very nature of our country and like what it's built on. It's called an election, and it is filled with ads, which we have a First Amendment right to put out there. And like everything the Lincoln Project did was completely on par with that, with those types of principles. But like there is no like public weigh-in outside of courts and ethics boards for like when you think that like a lawyer or a law firm should be representing someone. It's just not the business of the public. We have our own mechanisms for dealing that as a professional agency. And if you think that that's a problem, you petition the potential agencies for like malpractice or like whatever, or you write op-eds about it. But like, it's just not like to use the mechanism of public shaming and internet shaming, which is now so readily available to everyone. And I just think I obviously am losing this fight, but think should never be normalized as like a way of like of effective of like going after someone. And like, anyways, I just think that that's what they did here. And we have ways of dealing with this. They could have used any of them. And I think that would have been a more principled stance. And I just think that this was not a very principled way to go about like what is essentially, even though it has repercussions at its core, it's a problem of professionalism and like a problem of our particular I think of like our particular way of like being a lawyer, an attorney in the United States. I don't know. Do you think that's idealistic, Steve? I don't know.
No, I mean, I guess, Kate, where I'm stuck is that I don't think it's idealistic at all. I think the question is whether, in ordinary times, I would agree with every single word of that, right? I think the question is whether extraordinary times call for extraordinary reactions.
Yeah.
And, are we better off with courts? I mean, so for example, right, like, are we better off with courts indulging these lawsuits, right? Giving the plaintiffs every possible benefit of the doubt, giving them extensions to file, right? Not bouncing Rudy's pro hoc application, even though he lied about being a member in good standing of the DC bar. Like, are we better off with courts bending over backwards to indulge these cases, right? Or are we better off with courts actually issuing incredibly, sort of strongly worded dismissals of all of these claims as quickly as possible to just sort of, extinguish the fire? Like, okay, that's where I'm stuck. To me, it's the same conversation, which is, are we better off like pretending things are normal, or are we actually better off acknowledging just how abnormal things are?
So here's the thing, is like, I think that you can acknowledge how abnormal things are. I do not think that the way to acknowledge how abnormal things are is through encouraging extra legal, like doxing of individual attorneys that happen to work for the same law firm that like is doing all of this, all of this type of work. I just think that it has such, like, I don't want to live in a world where that ever becomes normal, or that ever becomes like we decide, some individual decides on their own that we're all of a sudden in an extraordinary circumstance. So it's totally fine to go take like a couple $1 million war chest and a couple million followers and launch war on someone. I just think that that's like an incredible, like, who, by the way, are like lawyers doing their everyday jobs at a law firm, not the president of the United States. And so like, I just don't think that is, I'm with you on like it being an extraordinary time. I just think that you can stick to the principles here and go after it for being an extraordinary time in different avenues. And I think that like the Lincoln Project brought the power of shame and ridicule, like, which was worked so well against a person like Trump, to a law firm. And it was an inappropriate exercise of whatever it is that they think that they're doing. And like, when is that going to stop, by the way? Like, if they do that for Jones Day, is there like anything that they're ever going to have? Like, it seemed, I don't know. And maybe that's just kind of like me being like, well, this was okay because they played by the rules of an election and all of this, although crazy that we have this third party, like kind of like, or not third party, but like third agency kind of weighing in and publishing these ads against a person that is not part of any particular party. That all seemed within the rules and principles that we kind of go by in terms of everything that was happening, particularly for a president who had put himself out there in such a way and had gone completely nuts and was so off the grid. But that just doesn't seem to be the same, like, of kind, when you're talking about like even a major law firm. It's a firm, like, it's not, I mean, and I would have felt the same, by the way, if it was like they'd gone after like low level people in the White House administration that, like, what if they went after janitors that like cleaned the toilets of the White House?
I hope I've been clear. I'm not defending the Lincoln Project, right? I actually have real problems with what they did. I just think that what these lawyers and these law firms are doing is very different from what the lawyers who are often attacked in the other direction are doing. And I think we ought to be able to be very clear in our minds about what those differences are. Right? That there is a difference between, as Justice Frankfurter said, right? There's a difference between looking out for what he says he says our most important procedural safeguards are made for cases involving not very nice people. Right? Yep. Which, is a canonical principle of criminal procedure, at least used to be. And I guess I just, think that like this is not that, and it's really and wholly apart from the Jones Day Lincoln Project imbroglio, I think I am concerned at the extent to which the Trump campaign is taking advantage of just the mere sort of time it takes for these cases to work their way through court to further destabilize and delegitimize the election. And I think, that's something in retrospect that like we're gonna wish hadn't happened.
Yeah. I mean, that's so Alan Rosenstein is here, one of my favorite people. And I'm not just saying that because I owe you a draft. That's 2 months late.
but you should feel free to keep buttering me up. I do like that.
I know. But Alan's here, and Ben disappeared for a second. He will be right back. But Alan, what are your thoughts on this? And also, I would be, and then Ben wanted you to talk about kind of some of the sedition prosecution stuff.
Yeah. First of all, Steve, hey man, how are you doing? It's good to see you.
You too.
How's Texas?
We have a governor in denial about COVID, but the weather.
I thought you were going to say the weather again.
I was going there. I mean, part of what makes the COVID part bearable is that we could be outside a lot more easily, I think.
We have a better governor, but a much colder climate in Minnesota. Right. So same time zone, more snow. I want to ask you though. I mean, so obviously these lawsuits are insane. But I guess my question is, what is the alternative to them in the sense of avoiding the delegitimization of an election? So, in the absence of these lawsuits, right, maybe Trump would concede, though of course he'll probably never concede, but maybe like the apparatus, the GSA would announce transition a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, or whatever the case might be. But at least with the judicial process, people have to go into court and they have to swear oaths and they have to not perjure themselves. And it becomes very, very clear. And I feel like almost becomes clearer through the judicial process that all of these crazy claims about fraud are meaningless, right? Because like Rudy can't just go on Fox News and blather. He needs to explain what he thinks opacity means, and apparently he doesn't know what opacity means.
But he still does. I mean, the problem is that he goes into court and says we have no evidence of fraud, and then Jenna Ellis goes on Fox News and says, "Look how great Rudy did in arguing that there's fraud." Right? Like I'm not averse. Like, listen, I am not anti-court. I mean, this is like talk about wrong-footing me. Right? I have too much faith in our judiciary. I think the problem is the way we do our elections makes this kind of nonsense way more possible than it needs to be. So, right, imagine if two different things were true. Imagine if one, we only learn the results the way the Brits do, right? Where when they're actually done counting, the state that had previously released 0 results has a press conference. The Secretary of State walks out and says, "Okay, with 99% of our votes in, here's the totals." So number one, right? Imagine if we didn't have the phantom red shift, blue shift nonsense. But number two, imagine if we had uniformity, right? That is to say, imagine if Congress actually imposed uniform deadlines, right? Uniform certification deadlines, uniform procedures for mail-in ballots. Like, imagine if we didn't have to do this one state at a time, one county at a time. Now, I'm not saying we should federalize elections. That I want to be very clear about that. But I think there are ways to split the difference where you still have elections administered by local and state officials where we're all on the same federal clock, right? And I think, and where we're also coordinating the release of results so that there's no opportunity for a candidate to say, "Hey, look, I won," and then everything shifted. I mean, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this last week, and I think, it's something we really ought to be like. How do we prevent the next Trump from doing exactly what Trump is doing now? That's not about the courts, to be honest. That's about the underlying legal rules.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying. Right? This is obviously. I'm not saying that Rudy walking into court and lying, or rather Rudy walking into court and not lying and just saying nothing and then lying on Fox News about it is a good thing. My question is more, we came to this conversation asking, okay, is it appropriate for a big law firm to represent what end up being fairly frivolous claims, right, assuming that they're not lying in court about them, which I think is true, right? Like, they're frivolous because Jones Day is sufficiently professional and they value their bar licenses enough, right, to not lie about it.
They're not going to perpetuate a fraud on the court.
Exactly. And so my question is, right, like, I think Ben is right. We want to protect the space for people like you and for people like Jen. And so we want to, as a general matter, default to the norm that, that we're not going to get angry when people represent lowlifes or unpopular, let's put it this way, unpopular entities in court. And then the question becomes, okay, well, should we make exceptions for that? And I take your point that, like, we should make exceptions for that in the really exceptional case of potential constitutional crisis and democratic deconsolidation. My question is just that, like, it doesn't strike me that what is causing this post-election turmoil is primarily the court issue. And if anything, the court issue is for those who want or who are open-minded enough to accept that Trump may have lost is actually a counterweight, right? And in the absence of the court, you'd have just the Fox News or whatever OANN madness, and the 30% of Trump's hardcore base would still think there was a grand conspiracy. So I don't know. That's kind of where I don't know, right? But that's my thought.
But Alan, I mean, so I guess the question is, how does this play out from here, right? I mean, so the Pennsylvania state law says that the Secretary of State is supposed to certify the results by November 23rd, right? That is next Monday, right? If she misses that deadline, nothing happens, right? The federal safe harbor deadline is December 8th. And so as long as Pennsylvania is certified by December 8th, it's fine. But, like, imagine she comes out Monday and certifies and says, we've looked at this, we've done what we can. No court has ordered me to not certify, yada, yada, yada. is that going to all of a sudden change the narrative from OAN, right? And from the sort of, the Breitbart world about how the election was stolen just because no court stopped the Pennsylvania Secretary of State from certifying the results the way that she was supposed to? Like, I guess I'm like, it's not that I disagree or dispute at all that it's really important for courts to be here. Because as you say, Alan, right, it's the courts who are the ones who are saying, hey, under oath, do you have any evidence? And the lawyers are saying, no. That's incredibly powerful. The problem is no one who needs to be listening to that is listening to that, right? The problem is that John Cornyn, who is shockingly the more rational of the two senators in my fakakta state, right, is still issuing these equivocal statements.
Good use of the word fakakta.
Thank you. Is still issuing these these fence-sitting equivocal statements about how we should let the legal process run its course. To what frickin' end? Like, none of these suits are going to change the outcome. So, how do we? I guess what I'm saying is, how do we change the popular culture so that the courts don't become just this, means, right? This thin reed, right? This distraction. That can actually, allow members of the Republican Party who should know better, right, to say, oh, no, let the courts run their thing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
So, yeah. Alan, while I was turned into a pumpkin, did you raise your very important question of seditious conspiracy?
I did not.
Well, that's what I brought you on to do.
Well, I was just waiting here patiently.
But then he was guest co-hosting for you.
Exactly. I see. Well, I thank you for that. But let's bring you back to your stated purpose, which was I brought you on because the theory was, well, maybe the answer to Steve's question is let these assholes pursue all legal remedies. But at the point at which it actually crosses certain legal lines, and they are actually specified in statute, prosecute them. And so I thought this segued rather well into the seditious conspiracy question that you wanted to raise. So I thought, to the extent it wasn't a good segue, we'd force it. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So here's my question. So I read I saw a headline in the Independent. I don't know why it's only been taken up by a UK newspaper so far, but so the Oath Keepers, which is this big right wing armed militia group, is saying stuff.
I went to law school with the head keeper, the head keeper man.
Well, maybe you have some insight here. So I'm just reading from this. The largest militia group says it will refuse to recognize Biden as president and resist his administration. Anything he signs into law, we won't recognize as legitimate, Oath Keepers founder says. Now, to be clear, all of this is perfectly First Amendment protected speech, right? No question about it. And just as when, Trump won in 2016 and everyone's like, Trump's not my president, that was all this is First Amendment protected, right? So to be very, very clear what I'm saying. My question is this, right? If you have my sense is that in this country, we don't do sedition prosecutions anymore, right? So sedition, right, is there's a statutory definition. I've been looking at it, but basically it's plotting to overthrow or otherwise attack the government of the United States. Sorry, that's seditious conspiracy, and then there's seditious acts by force, right? By force.
That's an important part of this.
Totally. As a general matter, we have not been very successful, nor have we tried terribly hard to use the sedition statutes, right? There was a famous case in 2010 out of Michigan where some bunch of people were plotting to kill a police officer, and the U.S. attorney at the time, Barbara McQuaid, brought one of these seditious conspiracy charges, and then it kind of went through the court system, and 2 years later it was thrown out by the judge. And as a general matter, no one seems to think that seditious conspiracy is a thing that's worth that the game is worth the candle, right? And everyone's like, look, well, there's so many federal criminal laws. Why bother with seditious conspiracy? So, for example, everyone knows about the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer in Michigan. Michigan is having a problem here. There's something wrong with Michigan. But there's this plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer, and the question is, well, what are these people going to be charged with? Is it worth charging them with seditious conspiracy when you can just charge them with something like kidnapping, right? And so I guess the thing I was thinking about was, and I appreciate being able to ask you this question, Steve, since I'm sure you've thought a ton about this. Like, do we need to, as a country, get back to, in very rare circumstances, but where the statutory predicates are met, charge people with things like seditious conspiracy, even if you can otherwise charge them with a bunch of other crimes? And the thinking would be, right, there are so many right-wing militia groups, right? And I could write a story on the left about this too, right? And this has happened in the past. Seditious conspiracy charges were used against, I think it was like Puerto Rican independence activists, 30 years ago, though I haven't looked into exactly, the merits of those cases. But, assuming we're going to have a Biden administration and a bunch of really pissed off, highly armed right-wing militias, it just does not strike me as terribly unlikely that we're going to see some sort of seditious conduct in the next several years. And I don't know, it seems to me that as a society, we should be able to send a signal through a prosecution for sedition that you have committed sedition. Like, that's what the problem was. It's not just that you tried to kidnap someone. It's that you were trying to, by force, conspiring to overthrow the government. And I don't know. This is the question I had, and I kind of want to ask all of you what you think about this. Or is this just really stupid?
I don't think it's stupid. I think the Michigan example is a bad example. Because which Michigan example? Sorry, the Whitmer example. 2010? Okay. The Whitmer example, because those yutzes, while we're doing Yiddish, right? Those yutzes weren't conspiring to overthrow the federal government. They were conspiring to overthrow the state government, right? And so, Michigan actually has a state treason law. And I actually am not, I, who Susan Hennessy will be the first to tell you, am Mr. No, it's not treason. I'm not sure that the plot against Governor Whitmer wasn't treason against the state of Michigan, right, or at least attempted treason against the state of Michigan. So Alan, I think the first part, right, is just that, like, I think we have to distinguish between state and federal. The second part is I get nervous about the very fine line between prosecuting seditious conspiracy and prosecuting sedition qua speech. Right, and I'm especially nervous when the Supreme Court's most recent relevant discussion of the First Amendment and national security is Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, which is about as people talk a lot about how John Roberts is, like, actually quietly this huge First Amendment defender. Go read that decision and tell me, and let's talk, right? I mean, like, so I guess, the question to me is, what are we not accomplishing with that, with insufficient seditious conspiracy prosecutions that we are that we'd be able to accomplish with more of them?
Yeah. So so all of your points are totally, you are 100% right in everything you said, right? And this is what, like, I've just been thinking about this for the last couple of hours, and I keep ping-ponging, right? I just wanted to just sort of think through this with some folks. So thanks, Ben, for letting me crash. The thing that we are not accomplishing when we don't use seditious conspiracy charges or treason against the state of Michigan charges or whatever, is we are not accomplishing the expressive function of saying that levying, well, I'm not levying war, because that's treason, but like that trying to overthrow your government is itself a harm, independent of whatever violence that involves that would ordinarily be a harm, right? And I think there's I think especially folks on the left, for a number of very plausible historical reasons, are uncomfortable with the idea that there is something especially problematic about action against the state itself, right? In part because the state has often in the past acted quite unfairly, and there's you have to draw the line between sedition and nonviolent protest somewhere, right? And I think it's an easy line to draw, but you can imagine abuses and how a government might abuse that ability, but that there's just this general discomfort in saying, no, you are not allowed to just decide that the laws of the United States do not apply to you, and that you are allowed to therefore try to overthrow that government by force, right? I remember thinking this back when the whole Bundy Ranch standoff during the Obama administration, and I totally get why it did not make sense to hugely escalate that conflict by using words like sedition and treason, but that's what it seemed to me at the time. as an observer, that this is not a problem simply because someone is squatting on federal land that's not theirs. It's a problem because they are like out there being like, nope, federal law just doesn't apply to me because I have a bunch of guns and I don't care. And I feel like we're missing something if we're not willing to go into court and say that is what you are being charged for.
But I mean, I guess the question is, if you are, the assistant U.S. attorney, or let's say you're the head of the assistant attorney general in charge of the National Security Division, are you willing to risk an acquittal, right? At the expense, to make when you have this is like all the terrorism cases that get brought as material support prosecutions, right?
I love this is a great point, Steve.
Where the government may have evidence that it could use to prove more serious offenses, but when you've got the material support statute on the books, which has a 10-year sentence availability, and I don't think I have to tell this crowd that to prove material support you don't have to prove almost anything, right? Al, I guess the problem is it's a difference between like the expressive function of law and the practicalities of litigating, and why prosecutors, Sorry,
but the expressive functions, like that's what I was just going to say. Is there something First Amendment related happening here that is tied up and makes everything about sedition also much more difficult? I mean, as a fundamental, it's like
John Adams' fault.
Yeah, that fucker. But there's seriously, I think that Steve is exactly right, because I do think that you take on a lot more with a conspiracy charge generally, and then you take on it even more with something like sedition because of it goes up against, has First Amendment concerns. And then I think that you weigh that against the ability to actually do do what you're supposed to do, which is to ensure a conviction. And I think you really, I just think that that it just really becomes not a question of kind of a bunch of people having a drink and talking about what could be possible, and it becomes well, we can't responsibly do that.
And I think it really, this to me is one of the great questions about the Biden Justice Department, right? Because I think there were any number of ways in which the Obama Justice Department was incredibly timid in sort of trying not to play into narratives that, for example, they were going after the Tea Party, or they were going after gun rights, or they were going after even the Bundys, right? Per Allen's example. They wouldn't, they wouldn't really look that carefully into torture, right? During the Bush administration. There was a lot of sort of, better for us to sort of stay above the fray from the Obama Justice Department. And it accomplished exactly nothing, right? It bought them no political goodwill from the right. Right, it bought them no maneuvering ability on any issues on which some kind of conciliatory move might have been beneficial. And so I think there's this fascinating question now for whoever the next attorney general is about whether, the lesson from the Obama administration is the Republicans are going to tar and feather you no matter what you do. So die on the Hill, right? Or is the lesson, no, let's, we still have to try to look like we're not just, doing things for, to send political messages.
Ben, you're muted.
Ben.
We got to go to audience questions, which means we have to turn Alan into a pumpkin. Watch this. That's very satisfying. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Hello, Professor Vladeck. I don't know if you remember me. I took your con law class and a bunch of others a million years ago.
Sure.
Back at American University. Anyway, my question is, what meaningful changes can be made to the Federal Vacancies Reform Act to limit the kind of abuse we saw with the Trump administration's appointments of acting officers to avoid Senate confirmations?
It's a great question, Jacob. I wrote a piece for Just Security about ways that we might reform the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. What's really interesting about the Federal Vacancies Reform Act is all of a sudden, if the Democrats don't regain control of the Senate, I actually think that the Biden administration is going to be potentially quite into the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, especially if the Republican Senate next year is unwilling to confirm a bunch of nominees who really ought to be confirmable. But I guess the sort of the short version is that I would really try to make it so that there are fewer options, right? So that the agency succession rules really do have to be followed unless there's a really good reason to depart from them, right? So that you can't just pick any random person who's been confirmed by the Senate anywhere in the executive branch and make them the acting attorney general or the acting secretary of defense. There are smaller technical fixes that I think would also be very helpful to avoiding some of the mischief we've seen, especially with the Department of Homeland Security. But I would sort of start big picture with why it's important for agency succession rules to have precedence and why we should not be incentivizing presidents to ignore the sort of the confirmation process, right? Why we should actually make it harmful for presidents to not submit nominees.
All right. Concerned citizen, the floor is yours. And awesome hat.
Thanks. Do you think there could be any public sector solutions to the problem of systematically deceptive and misleading quote unquote news outlets? If so, are there any specific kinds of solutions that may or may not be good avenues to explore? Please exclude consideration of what is politically practical in the upcoming Congress and speak in terms of systems design consistent with the American framework and values.
I mean, that is an incredibly tough question. I think one place where I'd start is I would love to reopen a conversation about the fairness doctrine, right? The sort of the old school idea that holders of broadcast licenses actually had to, like, the actual legal requirement that, you know, media outlets provide information that is fair and balanced. That's actually the sort of the original piece of that story. So I guess, you know, I would love to have a conversation about sort of not letting people. I get nervous about regulating speech because then you're turning the government into a censor. But I would like to see the government not necessarily facilitating the distribution of untruthful speech. And so, you know, I think the fairness doctrine would be one place to start. On the flip side, I think that's, you know, an easy target for new conservative judges to swing at. And so I don't know. It's a tough conversation, but I would start with I'm a Brandeisian, right? I think that, you know, the way that you respond to untruthful speech is with truthful speech, as opposed to, you know, cutting off the speech. And so that's where I would start in thinking about it.
David Botts, you get this question, which is a return to yesterday's conversation, a matter on which I think Steve and I may disagree, but I'm not sure.
I see your Easter egg today. I saw it yesterday too, but I'm claiming it now.
Excellent. Very good. Congratulations. So, Professor Vladeck, should Senator Lindsey Graham be investigated pursuant to Georgia Code 212604, which makes it a state crime, not a federal crime, a state crime, to perform criminal solicitation to commit election fraud?
And let me add something to what is the predicate offense that he would be accused of soliciting?
Okay, so the short version is, if I were the Attorney General of the state of Georgia, I actually might open an investigation into this situation, not because I have any particular interest in filing charges and actually arresting a sitting United States senator and prosecuting him criminally, but rather because I would want to at least send a message that this is not appropriate behavior. And, you know, the way that I am not an expert on Georgia election law. All I know is what I spent a good chunk of yesterday reading. But the way I understand Georgia election law is that when a U.S. senator calls a Secretary of State and tries to entice the Secretary of State into altering the official tallies of the ballots, right? The person who's calling the Secretary of State is soliciting the Secretary of State to himself violate Georgia election law, which is where both Section 604 and Section 597, I think, might have something to say. So I don't know that you could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Lindsey Graham violated those provisions, But prosecutions have been opened for far less. And the notion that it would ever be appropriate for a United States senator in one state to call the Secretary of State of another state, right? In any context, let alone with the specific purpose of trying to sort of encourage him to toss legal ballots, is something that if I were a state attorney general, even of the same party as that senator, I would find offensive and worthy of making a whole lot of noise about.
All right, so let's walk through it for a second. The question he is, according to Mr. Raffensperger, is that his name?
Raffensperger, I thought.
Yeah, Raffensperger. That he is supposed to have asked is, would it be appropriate, or is there any way to throw out a whole batch of votes if there's a high rate of non-signature matches in a particular jurisdiction? Why would that be reasonably understood as soliciting an offense rather than inquiring of a relevant official as to the propriety of a certain course of conduct?
So this goes back to one of the more, I think, illogical non sequiturs in the Trump campaign's legal arguments, right? Which is that procedural problems with a handful of ballots are somehow grounds to throw out all of the ballots. That's not how elections work. And so, the way that Raffensperger relayed the call, multiple times, by the way, is that Graham was actually asking him not just, right, to look at the jurisdictions where there was a high ratio of mismatches, but to actually sort of throw out all of the ballots, even the ones without mismatches from those jurisdictions, on the ground that there was just, you couldn't trust them. And if that's,
But people ask public officials to do things that they're not supposed to do all the time, right? Like,
to break the law?
Well, so first of all, if a crowd chants "lock her up" at
we had this conversation yesterday
at a candidate about the Michigan government, a person who's actually the president, and we don't say that that's solicitation of illegal incarceration. We say, hey, one of them took an oath to be the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, and the others are a bunch of fucking yahoos.
But if a United States senator, so imagine if Graham had called the Attorney General of Georgia, right, not the Secretary of State of Georgia. Graham, who is not a Georgia politician, right, an out-of-state politician, calls and says, you have to bring charges, even if you have no probable cause. You have to bring charges against this person, and you have to do it now, right? I think that's a much closer scenario to this one than a whole bunch of people chanting "lock her up" about Gretchen Whitmer. Because it's who he is who matters. Right? Like, Graham is not some random person calling Raffensperger, right? Graham is the chairman of the Senate frickin' Judiciary Committee.
And what would the crime be? Let's say Raffensperger went out and said, okay, if there are, I'm going to throw out votes if there's even a whiff of a suggestion that there is fraud in that district. Would that be a felony?
So,
or would that just be him not doing his job?
There are the Georgia Election Code, as I read it, which is to say pretty briefly, right, makes it unlawful, right, to hinder state election officers in the performance of their jobs, right? It also makes it unlawful for the election officers themselves, right, to not sort of count all the votes, right, to throw out votes without good reason. Right. And so, the notion is that Graham is basically asking Raffensperger to do something that Raffensperger could not lawfully do himself. And that Graham is uniquely situated because of his stature and influence to exert pressure on Raffensperger that a common citizen could not. Again, I don't think this would hold up in court. But
okay, then we're not disagreeing. Because when this came up yesterday, somebody asked whether I thought there should be an investigation. And I said, I can't imagine there would eventually be a charge. And And so I wouldn't think about it in the criminal context. And somebody cited me, in fact, David Botts, who just posed this question, cited me your tweets about the Georgia Code. And so the question was, well, were we disagreeing or not? And it actually sounds like we're not really disagreeing. You're saying, hey, there's a colorable argument that might predicate an investigation, but you can't imagine that it would actually stand up as the end of the day as a charge.
As criminal charges. But let me just say before we drop to get off the topic, but damn if this isn't an appropriate subject for a Senate Ethics Committee investigation.
Oh,
yes.
No question. And as Kate pointed out yesterday, it's the sort of thing that you should lose your seat in the Senate over in an election. Unfortunately, he just got reelected. And so
we think, unless he pulled the same shit in South Carolina.
All right.
Who's to say?
All right. I have one more question before we wrap up, Steve. It's a very important question.
Uh-oh.
Do you have anything to say to Chad Wolf, acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security?
I told you so, right? I mean,
I think you've earned it.
Some of us have been arguing for the better part of 14 months that he's been unlawfully serving as the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, and that may actually no longer be true as of Friday.
This is the same person that you were upset about his Twitter label, right?
No,
that's Cuccinelli.
That's Cuccinelli. He's even worse.
But they rise and fall together because the same machinations that made Wolf's appointment as acting secretary and everything he did for the last 14 months or however long it's been unlawful are also why Cuccinelli was never lawfully appointed, but also is probably violating federal criminal law by continuing to refer to himself as the acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security.
That's just so screwy to me. But for what it's worth, I still remain that is an issue for us to deal with in the federal government of him claiming that, and not for Twitter to start fact checking the crap everyone says on their Twitter bios. But that's still so strange. Like, does he do that outside? Does he have it as any other, is it he cited in interviews or things like that, or introduced as that?
I don't know. I have not carefully studied the subject because I really try not to lose sleep over what Ken Cuccinelli is doing with his lives. But I will just say that I think there's no better encapsulation of everything that's wrong with the Trump administration from a procedural perspective than how the Department of Homeland Security has been run since April 7th, 2019, right? That, we still have the longest cabinet vacancy in American history, right? We have now the second attempt to retroactively bootstrap Chad Wolf into the position he was unlawfully appointed to in the first place.
Yep.
And all of this because they can't get someone through the Senate who's going to promulgate all of these offensive, horrendous immigration policies. And so, Ben and Quinta, are responsible for the phrase malevolence tempered by incompetence. I mean, when I think of that phrase, I think Chad Wolf. Chad Wolf is the poster child for that understanding.
I do want to close, however, with
that's our next T-shirt.
A DHS good news story. Because I think there's really only one over the last 4 years, but it actually warrants mention. There aren't a lot of people in the U.S. federal government who were political appointees of the Donald Trump administration whose careers and reputations were enhanced by the exercise. But we did, in the Trump administration, create a new agency devoted to cybersecurity and election security. It was successful. It stood up a lot of capability, and it has worked under the nose of the president, at wielding his authority to coordinate a lot of state and local governments in improving election architecture, voting security, and resilience to attacks. And Chris Krebs gets fired by tweet he came into government largely an unknown figure. He emerges from government somebody who has made an enormous accomplishment, and it largely has not been talked about until his firing was imminent, because a whole lot of people didn't want to put him in a difficult position. And so lots of people who worked with him and were very respectful of the work that he was doing, people like I mean, if you talk to the Nate Perseleys of the world, stuff that Chris Krebs was doing and that CIS has done over the last few years made an enormous difference in the success of this country's ability to hold an election. And I actually want to, with endorsing everything that Steve has said about the governance disaster that DHS has been, I just want to say, hey, even in those situations, I think Chris Krebs may be the senior Senate confirmed official until yesterday, that is, at DHS.
He was for a period of time until Pete Gaynor was confirmed.
Okay. And the president clearly didn't even know who he was, which was great. He is now fired, fired by tweet, which is the only reasonable way for somebody like that to go.
It's a badge of honor.
Because the president figured out who he was and what he was doing. And I just want to say, for those of us who spent a lot of time early in the Trump administration kind of wringing our hands about what the circumstances in which people should and shouldn't serve in political positions in the Trump administration, we were all talking about people like Jim Mattis and, should you go in for X or Y? And we weren't thinking about people like, we were in sort of the most abstract sense, but this is a position that I never would have predicted somebody would have been able to do successfully. And Chris did an incredible job. And to those who have been tweeting at me that we should have him on the show, he is, of course, welcome on the show.
He's already been on the National Security Law podcast. I just want to say that.
Indeed, he has. He's actually
a rare guest.
So that is
fancy.
That is a good example of stuff that, like, the sort of engagement that he has done over the last 4 years, which is, quiet professional engagements with people who take issues seriously. He only recently has done more kind of major media kind of stuff, which is why he's now out on his ass, unemployed. He will land just fine, and well-deserved. On that note, Steve Vladeck, come back anytime.
I hear we have a bone. I have to get your take on The Mandalorian. You
have to get
All I'll say is you'll have to listen to the next episode of the National Security Law podcast.
There it is.
Well, then you can go back and look at my Just Us Saturday and see what I have to say.
That's my secret way of saying, Kate, that I still haven't watched the season premiere of The Mandalorian.
Oh, really?
I just started watching it. There's been some stuff going on.
Well, if you quit the news, you have plenty of time, Steve. It's amazing.
And if I stopped coming on podcasts, I would have. I could have been watching The Mandalorian this whole time.
There we go. We will do a live viewing of The Mandalorian with Steve.
And Alexandra Petri.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well,
I would pay for that.
Tomorrow on the show, we will have Alessandro Nivola, who is not to be confused with Alexandra Petri. They are nothing alike, save that the root of their first names is the same. That will be 22 hours and 50 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore. And but in lieu of fun, we have tomorrow's monologue, which is going to be about Christmas trees and baby owls that get stuck in them.
That's what
How's that for a teaser?
That's what we've got in lieu of fun. See you tomorrow,
folks.
Thank
you so much, Steve.
Of course, great to be with you guys. See you soon.
Yep.